Good afternoon. We're here with John Sheaf, local historian, and Mrs. Wilcox and myself, Mrs. Arnott. And we are very lucky to be able to interview John about his knowledge of Hampton and its surroundings during World War II as part of our WWII Day remembrance. So John, welcome. Thank you so much for your time today. Could we start by asking you, what can you tell us about life in Hampton Village during World War II?
Yeah, sure. That's an interesting question, and I guess it sort of went in phases in some ways. I mean, as we all know, the war started in September 1939, but in a sense, that wasn't really the beginning of it, because even as early as 1935, the government had been writing to the local council to say, start making air raid precaution preparations and so on. And I know for a fact the following year they had a meeting in the hall in Church Street, and they were beginning to set up things like what we used to call ARP wardens, air raid precaution wardens, rescue parties, which were basically teams of people who went round, well, ultimately when bombing started, to pull people out of rubble or whatever, and various other organisational structures that would be necessary. And then, of course, as you come along, and in fact, of course, we changed council. I don't know whether you know, but prior to that time, we had a council, local council called Hampton UDC, Hampton Urban District Council, and that survived until 1937, and then it merged with some other authorities into what became called the Borough of Twickenham. So that was Twickenham, Witton, Teddington, Hampton Wick, and Hampton all came together into the Borough of Twickenham. So the council had just changed in 1937, so it was only shortly after that you know, the sort of war sort of became more and more into focus, and as it did, for instance, they distributed these Anderson shelters, you know, these corrugated iron shelters which had straight sides and curved roofs, and they put them in people's gardens, dug them down 4 feet, which I think is about 1.2 meters, and then covered them with earth, 15 inches of earth, which is, I think, around 40 centimeters. I'm not quite so good on the decimal, on the metrication, and so on. So people were beginning to prepare those, and by May of 1940, I think all the shelters had gone out in the borough. That was the Borough of Twickenham by then. Of course, the war itself, in a sense, was a phony war, as it was called at the time, because there weren't any bombs dropping in September 39. In fact, there were no bombs at all until August 1940, when the Blitz sort of came about. And the first bomb, in fact, the first bomb on the whole borough was on Hampton, on Tudor Avenue, in fact, and that was on the 24th of August 1940. So right until that time, so almost for a year, there was no bombing, even though people were making preparations.
That's incredible, and it's fascinating to think that people had had a sense of war coming for so long with those preparations. So as the war sort of took hold in terms of the Blitz and very much sort of bringing in the home front very much as part of the war, did the face of Hampton change significantly in that time, sort of 1940 to 1945?
Oh yes, I mean, again, even right from the very early start of the war, things were changing in the sense that, for instance, Hampton Junior School, as we call it now, although it was Percy Road Council School, it used to be called, but they had separate departments in those days, a separate mistress and a separate headmaster for the girls' school and the boys' school. Indeed, they were on 2 different floors. But right at the beginning of the war, the boys moved out of that school. They moved to, in fact, the old Hampton Grammar School site on the Upper Sunbury Road, because, as you know, the school had just moved, just literally within days, moved from that site to the present site on the Hanworth Road. And so that school premises were empty, you know, available. And so they moved the boys out, and they moved an ambulance depot and first aid post and ARP post into Hampton Junior School. So there were things like that going on all over the place, because there were various shelters, there was ARP posts. I mean, for instance, where the swimming pool is in the High Street, I don't know whether you know where the swimming pool is, but just opposite there's a road called Manor Gardens, and in that there's a huge, great green traffic island, and then underneath there's a huge, great public shelter was dug, which can hold 300 people.
Wow.
I mean, I don't know how filled in or otherwise it is, but if you look at it on one of these ground penetrating radar, you can still see the shape of that shelter under that traffic island to this day, in fact. So they may have bricked it up a bit, but the actual sort of outline of the shelter at least is still there. So there were things like that happening, and obviously as the war went on, people had to carry gas masks. They had helmets, tin helmets, because one of the problems wasn't necessarily that bombs were dropping, but when our side, as it were shooting anti-aircraft guns, you got splinters from the shells, and then they sort of rain down on you. So if you're out in a raid, then you want to make sure you have your tin helmet on, otherwise you'd be getting shards of metal, potentially hot metal as well, for that matter, coming down on top of you. So there were, various other things like that. And obviously, of course, rationing kicked in from a very early stage, and progressively got worse. It started off with petrol rationing, sugar rationing, bacon rationing, and so on. And gradually it went to encompass most foods. It was never for vegetables or fruit, but in fact, you couldn't necessarily get those anyway, because something which you might call more exotic, like bananas or oranges, you certainly couldn't get hold of, because it would have had to come from abroad. And clearly shipping, it was dangerous for ships to be moving around anyway, for be torpedoed, or they were needed for other, much more important purposes than transporting fruit around. So I guess, and butter, for instance, by the end of the war was down to 2 ounces, which I think is about 50 grams of butter per person per week, which is hardly anything at all, So I think people were, this is apart, of course, from the fact that their husbands, brothers, uncles, loved ones might be away fighting, and they were suffering those deprivations as well. So, and then of course, they had the bombing, and the Blitz, of course, as I mentioned, it started in August 1940 and went through certainly to the end of 1940. And I read in somebody's diary that I think it was on the 3rd of November of that year, they'd had 50 consecutive nights of air raids. Every single night for 50 nights. Well, you can imagine what that would do to your sleep and to your nerves and to everything else, let alone the pure danger of your house being, hit or damaged. And, so it was very traumatic times in many, many ways. And then, funny enough, there was another lull right until 1944, and that was called the Little Blitz, and that was in the first few months of 1944. And once again, the Germans managed to assemble 500 fighter or bomber aircraft up in the north end of France, and so they came across, and there was a significant bombing again in 1944. And then later on in that year, in the summer, in fact, they had these things you might have heard of called V1s or doodlebugs or buzz bombs. They had several different names, and they were basically pilotless planes that just flew along, and at a certain point the engine would cut out, and the craft would just dive bomb, usually straight into the ground or a house or whatever it happened to hit, whatever it was over at the time. And then later on, still a few months later, they had what they call V2s, which are a rocket-based missile, which could travel at 3,500 miles an hour. I mean, they were ridiculously fast, but luckily, there was only one of those dropped in the borough, and that was in Teddington, so Hampton didn't get any V2s, but it did get 27 V1s, and a lady in Longford Close off the Uxbridge Road was killed by one. So we did have a certain amount of V1s, but so very frightening, I imagine.
Absolutely.
We wondered, John, are there any stories or events that stand out to you about Hampton Village in wartime?
Yes, there is actually. I was talking to somebody a few years ago who was here as a young lad during the war, and it's a bit of a story. It goes on for a couple of minutes, but if that's sorry, I shouldn't really say that. But a bit of a preamble to my story. Is that all right if it goes on for a couple of minutes? I don't. Yeah, sure, okay. Right. So yes. Anyway, there was this young lad who was came to Hampton during the war, and in fact, although he only lived here for a few years, he had an absolute love of Hampton, and indeed had a fantastic recall. I met him many years later, but he came to Hampton because his parents came to a large house which had been requisitioned in Church Street in Hampton, and it was requisitioned as a so-called shadow factory. Now, shadow factories were new premises for factories that had been bombed out in central London, and so they dispersed them out to the suburbs and just moved them into large houses and so on, so that first of all they were disguised, because people would think it was a house, they wouldn't think it was a factory, and so on, and so they could carry on with the production of whatever they were doing. Anyway, this particular shadow factory was a leather factory, so it made, when it was a shadow factory, it made parts for leather flying helmets, straps for the RT, these radio telephone sets and things like that. And they had, I think, about 14 or 15 people working in there. Anyway, one day later on, I should say his parents were the caretaker and the cook for the house, because they cooked meals for the people who worked there and so on. Anyway, one day later in the war, his father had died, and so it was only his mother and he in the house, and she was rather deaf, and he was just in the kitchen drawing, pencil drawing, and because it was a shadow factory, and she'd gone upstairs to the bath. It was a three-story house, and she'd gone to the top floor to have a bath, and they had a bell or a buzzer in their house which used to ring, which meant there was a bomb coming in your direction, but you only had less than 2 minutes warning, because this was being, I think, this warning was coming in from Kingston. This was when the V1, the doodlebugs, the buzz bombs were coming along. So anyway, this bell or buzz or whatever rang while he was downstairs, and she was already in the bath. So anyway, he hurtled upstairs to try and warn his mother. But by the time he got there, he could hear the bomb coming, because they made a hell of a lot of noise. And so he realised there was nothing he could actually do. So he parted the curtains, which were covered in, they had sort of blinds, because part of the lease condition was they had to disguise what it was, and so therefore they had to have blinds up all day long. And so he had to peep out through the curtains, as it were. And because he was on the 3rd floor, he could look right out across Bushy Park, and he could see this bomb approaching at 350 miles an hour. And they were about 2,000 to 3,000 feet, these things. And you just saw the bomb coming. And just as it got to the house, the engine cut out, which usually was the sign that it was absolutely going to come straight down and, sort of obliterate you, basically. But fortunately, on this particular occasion, it just glided after it cut out, and it actually landed in Sunbury, because he ran to the other side of the house and saw the black smoke come up from Sunbury. And so after that, he said he was become so inured to bombing that he just went back downstairs to the kitchen, carried on drawing. His mother came down 10 minutes later and said, "Oh, I think we'll have a cup of tea." And he never did tell her the fact that she'd nearly been obliterated by this buzz bomb that had gone directly over their house and cut out just above their house. And I just found that a phenomenal story. He'd actually seen this bomb approaching across Bushy Park.
That's wow. That blows me away. I can't imagine the fear that must have been in him at that moment. But at the same time, then afterwards, how much he must, the feelings that must have run through him. Unbelievable.
It just makes you even tremble to even think about it, really. And yet that had become the normal, as it were, and it just, mind-blowing, really.
Yeah. Can I ask, John, are there any stories of young people or children that you've heard of during wartime here in Hampton?
Yeah, not so much, I suppose. I mean, one thing I suppose we have to remember, and I tend to forget it myself all the time, is that some children, of course, were evacuated during the war. And I mean, I've read in a diary of a woman who lived in Hampton that both her children were evacuated to Canada, for instance, which is a long way to be evacuated.
That's really interesting, because I don't think those of us in Hampton even today would feel that Hampton felt like a particularly dangerous part of London. And as a result, this sense that maybe you wouldn't have been evacuated. So to have children evacuated from Hampton is quite striking.
Yeah, sure. and I came across somebody from Hampton Junior School who was evacuated to Australia. I mean, I guess, you know, because they would have been relatives or whatever. That's why these huge distances were involved. But nevertheless, it does come as a bit of a surprise. You know, it's not just you know, evacuated down to the country. Some of them were evacuated these huge distances.
John, you mentioned about a diary. Have you found many diaries of people locally?
Not a huge number, I have to say. In the diary I was talking about there, in fact, is a series of diaries which, luckily, this woman kept diaries throughout her life, basically, and I happened to come across and obtain these diaries, and so, you know, I do have all of those diaries, although you know, some of the notes are pretty short about what happened. But I also did get access to this diary that I previously mentioned, from the woman whose daughters were evacuated to Canada, and the daughters actually kept the letters that she wrote to them while they were in Canada, and therefore, and we were able later to transcribe those letters and make a very interesting story about, you know, to us anyway, about what, you know, what had been happening, and because she was reporting what was going on in Hampton to her daughters who were, you know, at school by then in Canada, and so she was keeping informed on what was happening in the home front, and of course a lot of things were happening, like a lot of women, for instance, were going out to work because they established these day nurseries so that women could take over the jobs that men had traditionally done, like being bus conductors or conductors on the trolley buses, or some factory work, or bakers, delivery people, or milk delivery people. All these jobs, all of a sudden, there was a great requirement for people, because the people who had traditionally done them had gone off, you know, to fight the war, and so you know, nurseries would have to be established in order so that these women could then go out to work to these other jobs which were, you know, needed doing.
Fantastic. John, can I ask one final question?
Sure.
It's a bit broader, really, about your interest in history. What has led you to become a local historian? We know there are so many fields of history one can explore. What for you captured sort of your imagination in local history?
Yeah, it's a very interesting question, and it took me an extremely long time to work it out, actually. When I was at school, I was for whatever reason, I don't really know, I was always interested in architecture, but not architecture on a grand scale, but architecture in a street or a village or a town scale. And I used to enjoy walking around the streets and looking at things and trying to work out why certain things might be the way they were. And then when we moved to Hampton, well, I say it's not so long ago, it is now, I suppose it's in 78. So yeah, we moved here 42 years ago, but it doesn't seem that long ago. But anyway, when we moved here, well, I won't bore you with all the detail of the story, but I gradually came to sort of hone what my interest was, and I just happened to go to Hampton Library and found a book by W.G. Hoskins. In fact, I think it was Local History in England, but anyway, it's one of W.G. Hoskins's books, and he was an absolutely famous local historian. And it just, all of a sudden, I just realised, having read this book, that this is what I wanted to do. I went to Foyles in London the next day and bought every single book they had on local history, which I think was 12 or 14, I can't remember. I just bought the whole lot. I thought, this is absolutely the subject for me. It's got everything, you know. It can be about maps, it can be about people, it can be about buildings, it can be about old pictures, it can be, and you can combine all these things together and just makes, to me, just a fascinating story of how you can bring together all the elements of a locality and just tell its story, really, I guess.
Amazing. John, I could talk to you all afternoon. It's music to my ears. I am so grateful for your time, and you've been really, really insightful. The stories that you've shared, I would like to read more about for myself, and I hope that the same goes for the people watching this, that they've been inspired to learn more about Hampton history. So a huge, huge thank you, John. We are really grateful.